Mitch, when you think about fair lending today, and you and I had a moment to talk a little bit about HUD leadership and whatnot, what is that key fair lending concern that if you were going to break down the number one policy and focus that organizations should be aware of? Because when you're doing it right, referrals will come. At least that's the way we looked at it.
So the most critical fair lending concern that a lender has, that a business entity has, evolves around its business practices, its business rules itself, the manner in which it conducts business. And it is really, the question really is, does my business rule, does the manner in which I'm conducting my business create a disparate impact? Is one group more adversely impacted by this rule, by this overlay, by my underwriting criteria or guidelines than another group itself? When it comes to loan officers, the question could be one of disparate impacts, but more importantly, it's one of disparate treatment. Am I treating everyone the same? Am I treating them fairly? Am I spending the same amount of time that's necessary to take their application, to talk them through it? Am I showing them all of the products that are otherwise relevant to their particular needs? Or am I treating different people differently, which in fact could result to a fair lending claim itself? So what companies need to have and what loan officers need to follow is, number one, a fair lending plan. And it's required, and the CFPB looks for it right up front. And it starts off with a policy. And that is that, in fact, you are a lender that believes in fair lending, and your policies are to follow ECOA and the Fair Housing Act and to lend fairly and treat everyone equally along those lines. Number two, is the review process. Policies and procedures for how your business practices are going to be reviewed to ensure that you know and understand who's impacted by these practices. And are there any particular groups more adversely impacted than others? And how do you do that? Well, there are many good fair lending companies out there today that sell software to companies. And every company should be doing fair lending reviews. There are third parties that will do it as well. It's more expensive along those lines. But today the technology has gotten to the point where one can run reports internally. And every company should be looking at their originations on a quarterly basis. They should pull out some matched pairs. They should pull out some CFRs, comparative files, and do analysis to see why pricing is different between one minority borrower and someone else that might not be a minority borrower when it appeared on its face that they were similarly situated. These are the policies and procedures that the CFPB requires. These are the things that try to keep you out of trouble. Now, the two key critical areas in fair lending today really are pricing and underwriting. And so companies have to have good, tight policies about discretion in pricing exemptions. Are you going to have exceptions? Can a loan officer, for example, price down? And if so, under what circumstances can they price down? And the reality is discretion should be very, very limited. The CFPB doesn't want loan officers to have any discretion whatsoever, any. But that doesn't mean that you can't have some discretion, but you better have a really good, strong business justification for, in fact, making an exception, for pricing down, for example. So what is that? Competitive factors. But is it enough for you just to come up and say, well, I did it for competitive reasons? No. You have to have something. You have to be able to point to something that shows that, in fact, this borrower or someone else was making an offer to this borrower, or the rates that were being advertised at the time in this area, in this community, were, in fact, much more competitive. And in order to get that deal, you needed to match that particular deal. So pricing is really, really important. And the biggest problem we're finding in fair lending cases, and it's not just the CFPB, but the Justice Department brings these cases on a regular basis as well. The biggest problem that's out there really turns on discretion being given to loan officers, which in turn, on occasion, can be shown that that minorities are the ones that end up paying the higher prices. I mean, the reality is, and I don't believe it's intentional, I've represented this industry for 33 years now, but the reality is, year in and year out, statistically it's been shown. When someone's being priced up and when someone's being priced down, okay, it's generally more minorities or a heavier concentration of minorities that are paying the higher rates. And the reality is, I've heard this over the years, loan officers, lenders, they say, well, you know, it wasn't discrimination. Some people know to come here and negotiate. Some people don't negotiate. First-time homebuyers are less sophisticated and everything else along those lines. But I will tell you, the regulators and the Justice Department do not buy into those arguments at all. They do not. So you better have a more specific and precise business justification for pricing differentials if, in fact, you're in that position. Underwriting as well. You need to review overlays that you put on loans. You have to have very legitimate business reasons for the overlays itself, because your underwriting practices will be reviewed. They'll be run through a regression analysis to see whether or not a particular group is in fact more adversely impacted by that. And if they are, you in turn have to show that you had an absolute business necessity for that practice, for that particular overlay, and that there was nothing else you could have done less discriminatory that would have given you that same result. These are critical areas. Fair lending is the #1 priority of this administration, and it will be the #1 priority of all of the administrations to come, because fair lending is a matter of civil rights. So think about what you're doing there, think about how you're pricing, and think about how you're treating everyone, because you really need to treat them in a fair and equal manner. And in terms of companies, the policies that they need are policies that have to flush this out. You need these appropriate policies and procedures, and obviously training is absolutely essential, and so is oversight. You need to check to ensure that you don't have that disparate impact.
So Mitch, many of the executive leaders who are on this call, when they're formulating these policies and trying to fit in that stencil of ensuring that all of the variables are covered, one thing that we often hear in common is geography being a separator, whether it's for compensation or structure or just the way that they're presenting information to borrowers. How solid of a defensible position is geography versus the type of socioeconomic situations that you reference?
Well, let me put it this way. It is never an absolute defense to a fair lending action or a claim of discrimination itself. It may well be that different marketplaces, different MSAs, New York and California, or rural Kansas and Beverly Hills, will have different competitive markets, different overheads, different costs and expenses, and therefore different pricing. And generally, that different pricing is going to hold up, because you'll be able to document it and look to the marketplace and show the competitive pressures that are out there. But at the end of the day, when you talk about fair lending is global at your company. They're going to look at all of your lending to see whether there's any disparate impact itself. Then they're going to break it down by region, then they're going to break it down by branches, and then they're going to break it down by individual loan officers. That's how a fair lending analysis is properly done, and that's how regulators conduct their fair lending analysis. So you may well have a decent defense based on geography if you can really show those competitive pressures, those additional expenses, and items along those lines. But geography in and of itself is not sufficient. You can't simply say, well, I priced more over here in New York than I did in Massachusetts, without the business reason for why the pricing was in fact different. You always, because they're always going to look to see Who's paying more? How are the borrowers impacted by that, and which groups are impacted by it? So it's a defense sometimes, but it's not an absolute defense. In the end, you always have to take a look and see what the fair lending consequences are of your pricing policies.
Sure. And when you have multiple branches in the same zip code, then that becomes more difficult as well, right, Mitch? If two branches ended up pricing different, the geography defense becomes difficult.
Yeah, there is no geography defense, quite frankly, if two branches in the same zip code are pricing differently, unless one branch in that zip code, is also licensed to originate loans, someplace outside of the MSA, far away, and they price differently just in that different area. Then you do the analysis I otherwise just went through. But the truth is, to be prudent, to be safe, and this is what I tell my clients: you should at a minimum be pricing the same within an MSA, within a metropolitan statistical area. You're not going to be able to justify different pricing based on the fair lending implications that you're going to recognize. It's been shown over and over again in this industry that, in fact, when you price differently within an MSA, statistically, it's protected minority groups that end up being the ones that are paying higher. And that's a problem.